Hey guys, tonight we slip back through the mist into a land where the hills roll green. The air is heavy with turf smoke, and a drizzle has probably been falling since yesterday. You find yourself standing in medieval Ireland, not in a great stone castle or a bustling market, but at the edge of a damp field that belongs to a poor farmer. The path under your bare feet is muddy, and your cloak, well, you don't have a cloak. You're just shivering in a rough wool tunic that smells a little like sheep. Welcome to dinner, peasant style. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hut you're about to enter is nothing like a fairy tale cottage. Its walls are made of wattle and daub, branches woven together and smeared with clay and dung to keep the wind out. The thatched roof sags, heavy with rain. Inside, smoke curls lazily from a central hearth, filling the space with a haze that makes your eyes water. There's no chimney, only a hole in the roof. Every surface, from the low wooden stool to the straw-covered floor, smells faintly of smoke. This is where you and your neighbors spend most of your life, eating, sleeping, working, surviving. Dinner tonight, it's not glamorous. A pot of barley and oats bubbles away in a blackened cauldron suspended over the fire by a simple iron hook. That sound, the thick, glugging boil of porridge, is the soundtrack of the medieval Irish peasant. Day after day, meal after meal, it's oats, oats, and more oats. If you're lucky, there might be a few onions tossed in, or a sprinkle of wild herbs someone gathered earlier. If you're very lucky, a slice of salted bacon is hanging nearby, waiting to flavor the pot, though chances are it's already been eaten weeks ago. The fact is, for most peasants, meat was a festival treat, not a daily rite. You chew through oatcakes so dense they could double as building bricks, wash them down with ale that's more sour than sweet, and try not to think about how many more days in the week you'll eat exactly the same thing. Historians still argue whether peasants actually disliked the monotony or just accepted it as the way of life. Because honestly, what choice did they have? You notice something as you sit on the straw. The hearth fire isn't just for cooking. It's the heart of survival. The flames keep the damp away, the smoke dries out meat when there is any, and the embers serve as the only form of central heating you'll ever get. Children huddle close, coughing a little, while adults stir the pot with slow, steady motions, almost hypnotic in their rhythm. If you ever doubted how important a single flame could be, this is your answer. Without fire, there is no life here. And yet, even in this smoky gloom, there are small comforts. A chunk of cheese wrapped in cloth, crumbly and sharp, is passed around. A wooden cup of thin ale, brewed from leftover grain, goes from hand to hand. The ale is weak, barely stronger than modern soda, but it's safer than water from the stream, which may carry more than just a fish or two. Out in the field, barley sways under the drizzle. Barley is the real hero crop here. Easy to grow, fairly hardy against Ireland's endless rain, and useful for both bread and beer. It's not glamorous, but it's life. And then there's oats, of course, which thrive even in poor soil. Between barley and oats, the medieval Irish peasant is fueled enough to plow another field, mend another fence, and maybe dance a little jig when the ale kicks in. You can't help but notice the cattle, though. They aren't just animals, they're status symbols. To own cows in medieval Ireland is to hold wealth in walking form. Their milk gives butter, cheese, and sour curds, but more importantly, they can be counted, traded, and even used to pay fines. Imagine someone crashing your fence. You don't sue them, you demand 2 cows. The Brehon laws, Ireland's ancient legal codes, practically measure everything in cattle, from insults to injuries. You might not eat beef often, but you sure as daylight boast about how many cows you own. And yet, tucked into this smoky, muddy world, you get a sense of something deeply human. Food isn't just survival, it's routine, ritual, community. The pot in the center, bubbling away, isn't just calories, it's the anchor of life. The humble porridge, spooned out into wooden bowls, binds the family together just as surely as the thatch binds the hut. Quirky little detail. Every so often, peasants buried pots of butter in bogs to preserve them. Imagine stumbling on one of those centuries later, creamy, still edible, though you might not want it on your toast. It's the kind of find that makes archaeologists grin and makes you question just how desperate people were for storage. As you sit there, spoon in hand, smoky eyes watering, stomach warming with oats, you realize this is what it means to eat at the bottom of medieval Irish society. Simple, filling, repetitive, but also dependable, because tomorrow and the next day that porridge will still be bubbling, and as long as the fire burns, you'll make it through. The porridge in your bowl is cooling now, thickening into a paste that could almost glue the hut walls if you spread it there. You scoop another mouthful, chewing slowly, because this is all there is, and wasting even one oat feels like a crime. As you sit there, you realize that what you're eating isn't just food, it's survival in its simplest form. Oats, barley, water, maybe a pinch of salt. That's it. And the drink in your hand. That cloudy ale is your lifeline. Forget about clean, fresh water from a tap. It doesn't exist. Rivers and wells might look inviting, but one sip of contaminated water could send you straight to a stomachache that you won't walk away from. Ale, even weak ale, is boiled and brewed, which means it's safer, and it gives you a little buzz to keep trudging through the mud. Historians still argue whether children drank this daily or only on occasion, but the fact remains. Ale was everywhere, almost like a liquid form of bread. Picture your day. Sunrise comes early, damp and gray, and you drag yourself from the straw bedding. Before you head out to the fields, you grab a quick bowl of cold porridge left over from last night, washed down with another swallow of ale. It's not a breakfast of champions. It's more like a breakfast of just barely making it. But it fills your stomach enough to get you walking. By mid-morning, you're already sweating, swinging a wooden hoe or guiding a crude plow pulled by a half-starved ox. Your body burns through food fast, but luckily, oats are slow to digest. They give you steady energy, not the sugar rush of candy bars, but a dull, constant fuel. Medieval Irish peasants didn't count calories, but if they did, they'd realize they were running on diets of nearly 3,000 calories a day, almost entirely from grains. Protein was scarce. Fat was precious. And fiber, oh, you had plenty of that whether you wanted it or not. At midday, you pause, squatting in the field, and unwrap an oatcake from a piece of cloth. It's heavy, thick, a little scorched from the griddle. You gnaw on it slowly, washing it down with another sip of ale. There's no feast, no variety, just the same foods reshaped into slightly different forms. If you're lucky, someone has flavored the cake with a bit of wild garlic or leeks, giving it a bite. If you're not, it's just plain oats again, chalky and filling. But here, where it gets quirky, not all ale was equal. Wealthier folks might enjoy stronger brews, almost like modern craft beer, while peasants often drank what you might call small ale, barely alcoholic, thin, but safe to drink. Sometimes, if grains were running short, you brewed ale 3 times from the same batch, each weaker than the last, until you were basically drinking oat-flavored water. Think of it as medieval recycling. There's another oddity too. While barley and oats ruled daily life, wheat was considered fancy. It didn't grow as easily in Ireland's damp climate, so bread made from wheat was rare and expensive. If you managed to taste a slice of wheat bread, you'd probably never forget it, soft, white, a far cry from the dense, gray slabs of oatcake you normally choke down. For peasants, it was almost mythical, the food of lords and kings. Back in the hut that evening, after a day of back-breaking labor, you circle the hearth again. The cauldron has been refilled with grain and the same bubbling stew waits for you. Maybe tonight it's flavored with a scrap of salted fish left over from a neighbor's trade. The salty tang is a shock of flavor in your mouth, and you savor every bite. You glance at the others around the fire, everyone slurping in silence, grateful for the smallest variation. But here's the big truth. Peasants weren't eating to enjoy themselves. They were eating to not die. The rhythm of porridge, oatcakes, ale, repeat wasn't about taste, it was about survival. Historians still argue whether malnutrition was common or if peasants actually managed surprisingly balanced diets thanks to milk, fish, and wild greens. But when you're crouched on a smoky floor watching steam curl from your bowl, you're not thinking about nutrition charts. You're thinking, is there enough for tomorrow? Every spoonful is a reminder of how fragile life is here. A bad harvest, a stretch of cold, a flooded field, and suddenly the porridge pot is empty. You've seen neighbors' huts go silent when grain stores run out. You've heard stories of desperate families thinning their gruel with too much water, tricking their stomachs into thinking they've eaten more than they have. It's a grim reality, one you try not to dwell on as you swallow your last bite and lick the wooden spoon clean. Still, there's comfort in routine. You know tomorrow will bring the same porridge, the same oatcake, the same ale. And in a world where so much is uncertain, the weather, the cattle, the landlord's demands, there's something strangely reassuring about the sameness. Oats may not taste like much, but they keep you standing, working, and breathing. And so you lean back, belly full of grains and ale, smoke still burning your eyes, and think, maybe survival itself is the real flavor of life here. Your stomach might be heavy with oats, but there's another smell drifting in the air tonight, something tangy, rich, and strangely comforting. It's dairy, and in medieval Ireland, dairy isn't just food, it's practically a religion. Milk, cheese, butter, these are the real treasures of the Irish countryside, even more valuable than bread in some households. And right now, someone is stirring a clay jar of sour milk that's about to be passed around. Don't make that face. You're going to drink it. Milk straight from the cow is common enough, though peasants usually let it sour on purpose. Sour milk might not sound appetizing to modern ears, but here, it's safer and lasts longer than fresh milk, which spoils quickly in Ireland's damp climate. You take a cautious sip, and it's thick, tangy, almost like drinkable yogurt. Not bad, actually. It fills you up fast, and in a world where every calorie matters, that's gold. Then there's butter. Oh, the butter. You've never seen so much reverence for a lump of yellow fat. A wooden churn sits in the corner where someone has spent the better part of an hour pounding a staff up and down, rhythmically, until golden butter emerges from the milk. Spread thick on oatcakes, it transforms your gray, tasteless meal into something almost luxurious. But butter isn't just for eating, it's wealth. It's stored in clay pots, traded for favors, even offered as rent to landlords. In fact, butter is so important that people bury it in bogs to preserve it. And here's the quirky part. Archaeologists have found some of these bog butter stashes still intact centuries later, perfectly preserved in the cool, oxygen-free mud. Yes, technically edible, though I wouldn't spread it on toast unless you're feeling adventurous. Cheese, too, makes an appearance, though not the hard, aged wheels you might imagine. Most Irish medieval cheese was soft, crumbly, eaten fresh. Think of it as halfway between feta and cottage cheese, salty and sharp. It crumbles into your porridge or spreads easily onto oatcakes, and suddenly your diet feels a little more varied. Milk, butter, and cheese together form what's sometimes called a milk kingdom, because without them, Ireland's peasants would hardly get enough fat or protein to survive. And don't forget curds and whey. Yes, that nursery rhyme you half remember had a basis in real medieval diets. Curds were considered wholesome, filling, and easy to make. Whey, the liquid left behind, was sometimes drunk straight or used in cooking. It sounds humble, maybe even boring, but it kept whole families alive through lean times. As you sip another mouthful of sour milk, you notice how deeply tied cattle are to every part of life here. They're not just a food source, they're a currency. The number of cows you own defines your social standing. Cattle raids are practically a national pastime, celebrated in epic tales where warriors steal herds instead of jewels. Even kings measure their wealth in cattle, not coins. It's no wonder the food that comes from them is so prized. Historians still argue whether dairy dominated the Irish diet because people truly preferred it or simply because it was reliable. After all, cows keep producing milk even when crops fail, as long as the herd survives. In that sense, milk was insurance. And for children, growing up on bowls of curds and sour milk likely meant better chances of survival in a world where famine lurked around the corner. There's also a sacred edge to all this dairy devotion. Old Irish law texts sometimes forbid people from stealing butter or cream. Punishments were harsh, because to take someone's butter was to steal their survival. Butter was even used in rituals, offered to gods or spirits, perhaps as a symbol of prosperity. Imagine smearing golden butter as part of a ceremony. It's food and magic rolled into one. You lean back, licking the last traces of butter from your fingers, and it hits you. Without dairy, medieval Ireland would collapse. Grain might be the backbone, but milk and butter are the lifeblood. Even kings, with their fancy feasts, relied on dairy as a staple. The rich might flavor it with honey or herbs, but the poor and powerful alike cherished it. Quirky side note: in some tales, warriors supposedly carried balls of hardened butter wrapped in cloth, ready as quick snacks on journeys. Picture medieval trail mix, except instead of nuts and raisins, you're gnawing on butter lumps. Delicious, debatable, but effective, absolutely. So as the fire burns low and you savor the tang of sour milk, you realize you're living in a land where cows rule. Butter is buried treasure, and the humble churn is more powerful than any king's scepter. And tomorrow, when the porridge pot bubbles again, you'll be hopping someone's slips in a spoonful of butter to make it just a little more bearable. The morning mist hasn't burned off yet when you find yourself walking away from the fields, basket in hand, toward the edge of the forest. Farming fills bellies most of the year, but there's always a need for more flavor, more variety, more food in case the harvest falls short. And that's where foraging comes in. For peasants, the woods, rivers, and coastline are more than background scenery. They're a second pantry. The forest floor is damp, covered in moss and fallen leaves, and you stoop low, picking handfuls of hazelnuts. Crack one between your teeth, and the earthy crunch is a welcome change from the monotony of oats. Nuts are calorie bombs, tiny packages of fat and protein, and in this world that's like striking gold. If you're careful, you gather enough to last through winter, storing them in woven sacks tucked away in the smoky hut. Then there are berries. Blackberries stain your fingers purple, wild strawberries burst tart and sweet on your tongue, and sloes, those sharp little fruits, can be fermented into a rough sort of wine. You chew slowly, savoring the taste, because these small fruits feel like luxuries after endless bowls of porridge. Historians still argue whether medieval Irish peasants consumed these wild treats often, or if they were more occasional snacks. But either way, stumbling across a berry bush is a blessing. You wander further and find mushrooms sprouting from damp logs. Careful now. Pick the wrong one, and you'll regret it if you live long enough to regret it. But the locals know their fungi, and they've passed down knowledge of which mushrooms flavor stews without sending you into visions of fairies. You drop a few into your basket, imagining them sizzling in a pan with butter. Closer to the shore, the salty tang of the sea greets you. Here, the forager's bounty changes shape. Seaweed clings to rocks, and though you might wrinkle your nose at it, dried seaweed adds minerals and flavor to soups. Limpets, mussels, and cockles stick stubbornly to stones, and with a little effort you pry them free. A quick boil later and you've got seafood, chewy but filling. You slurp down a mussel, tasting the ocean itself. Quirky fact: some Irish saints supposedly ate nothing but shellfish and seaweed during long fasts, proving that even austerity could be salty. Fish, too, are part of this gathering life. With nothing more than a hand net, you scoop trout or eels from shallow streams. The eels, slimy and twisting, might not look appealing, but roasted over a fire, they turn rich and fatty, a prize meal. Salmon, especially, is the true prize, so beloved in Irish lore that legends tell of the salmon of knowledge, a magical fish that grants wisdom to whoever eats it. You may not be granted enlightenment today, but you will be fed. The variety in your basket now is astonishing compared to the gray porridge pot back home. Nuts, berries, mushrooms, shellfish, herbs. Foraging doesn't just add flavor, it adds survival insurance. When fields flood or harvests fail, these wild foods make the difference between hunger and hope. Historians still argue whether foraging was a daily practice or just a seasonal supplement, but what's clear is that the Irish countryside was generous for those who knew how to look. And sometimes foraging turns into hunting. You set a snare for rabbits, hopping one hops into it overnight. Rabbits are technically considered game, and peasants aren't always legally allowed to hunt them, but a hungry stomach isn't concerned with royal decrees. If you're caught, you might pay in cattle or coin, but when hunger gnaws, you take the risk. A rabbit stew flavored with wild garlic and mushrooms feels like a meal fit for a king, even if you have to whisper about it so the landlord doesn't hear. A final quirky tidbit for you. Archaeologists once uncovered the preserved stomach contents of medieval Irish skeletons, and in some cases, they found traces of seaweed. That means even the poorest, far from the coast, sometimes had access to dried seaweed carried inland. Imagine trading a handful of hazelnuts for a salty strip of kelp. It sounds odd, but in a land of limited options, it was worth it. By the time you head back, your basket is full, your back aches, and your shoes, or what's left of them, are caked in mud. You trudge home, ready to dump your finds into the communal pot. Tonight's meal will be richer. Oats, yes, but also flavored with berries, mushrooms, maybe even a mussel or two. It's not much, but compared to endless porridge, it's a feast of the forest and shore. You step back into the smoky hut, the fire still glowing. And as you drop your basket down, you realize this. Survival in medieval Ireland isn't just about farming. It's about knowing where to look when the fields fall short. And with that knowledge, you've bought yourself and your family another day of warmth, flavor, and life. The basket of berries and nuts is set aside, the last shellfish scraped into the bubbling pot, and you notice something else weighing on this household's daily choices: religion. The church bell in the distance tolls faintly, carried on the damp evening wind, and suddenly your entire menu shifts. Food in medieval Ireland isn't just about what you have, it's about what you're allowed to eat. And that's where fasting and feasting come into play. The Irish were deeply Christian by the Middle Ages, and the church laid down a dizzying list of rules about when and what you could eat. Ordinary days, you might scrape by with porridge and milk, but when the calendar says fast, meat is forbidden. No pork, no beef, no juicy roast rabbit you risked catching. Instead, you're pushed toward grains, vegetables, fish, and dairy. That's right, milk, butter, and cheese often escape the ban, which is why they loomed so large in Irish diets. You sip sour milk again, and suddenly it feels less like survival food and more like blessed loophole. But fasting wasn't just about Lent, the long period before Easter that demanded meatless meals for weeks. It was also about Wednesdays, Fridays, and holy vigils, which stacked up to a lot of no-meat days. Historians still argue whether peasants strictly followed every single fast, or if rules relaxed in rural areas where bishops weren't exactly snooping in smoky huts. Chances are, poor folk did what they could. Follow the rules when possible, quietly bend them when hunger bit too hard. Still, fasting didn't always mean going hungry. In fact, it gave rise to whole new food traditions. Fish, for example, gained center stage during these times. Trout from rivers, eels from streams, salmon from coastal runs all became stars of the table. You bite into a chunk of smoked eel, chewy and savory, and it feels like an upgrade compared to plain porridge. Salted herring, dried cod, even shellfish became staples of fast days, proving that restrictions sometimes created variety. On the flip side, feasts were explosions of indulgence. Step into the chieftain's hall on a saint's feast day or at Christmas and the rules flip. Tables groan under the weight of roasted meats, boar, venison, beef, pork, spitted and turned until fat drips into the flames. Bards sing, dogs scavenge underfoot, and goblets of ale and mead clink together. You tear into a piece of roast pork, and the crackling skin shatters between your teeth. It's greasy, rich, overwhelming, almost too much after months of oats and milk. But here's the funny part. Peasants sometimes benefited from these feasts too. Leftovers from noble halls might trickle down, or entire communities might share in festival meals after a successful harvest. For one night, even the poorest stomachs swelled with meat and ale, and the memory of it lingered long after the hunger returned. There's also a curious middle ground between fast and feast. Saints' days where special foods were shared, not extravagant but symbolic. Honey might be drizzled on oatcakes to honor a holy day, or fresh milk offered in blessing. Rituals mixed with survival here. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was devotion. And quirky tidbit. Medieval monks in Ireland, who were supposed to live simple, disciplined lives, sometimes bent the fasting rules in rather creative ways. Some records suggest that while meat was technically forbidden, monks argued that eating animal fat or broth didn't count. Others stretched the definition of fish to include aquatic birds like puffins. Imagine sitting in a monastery, chewing puffin under candlelight, convinced you're still being obedient. As the evening in your hut stretches on, the rhythm of fasting and feasting starts to make sense. Restriction followed by indulgence, lean days balanced with fat ones. It mirrors the natural cycle of hunger and plenty in Ireland itself. One day you're surviving on oats and sour milk, the next you're gnawing on venison at a feast, and in both moments you're tied to something bigger: the church, the seasons, the community. The cauldron spits as another muscle pops open, and you realize the calendar isn't just keeping track of days, it's shaping every bite you take. Faith and food walk hand in hand here, and whether you're fasting or feasting, both teach you the same lesson: gratitude for whatever lands in your bowl. The fire in the center of the hut crackles, and you find yourself staring at the cauldron again, realizing just how vital this simple piece of iron is. Cooking in medieval Ireland wasn't just about food, it was about fire, tools, and technique. Without the right hearth or pot, even the humble porridge you've been choking down would be impossible. Look closely and you'll see the blackened cauldron dangling from a crooked iron hook, suspended above glowing embers. This pot is everything. It holds your grains, your milk, your foraged mussels, even the occasional scrap of meat. A single family might own only one good cauldron, and losing it could be as devastating as losing a cow. In fact, under the old Brehon laws, stealing someone's cauldron was punishable with heavy fines, because no pot meant no dinner. But not every meal needs a pot. On the flat hearthstone, someone presses a lump of oat dough into a crude griddle bread. It's a bannock, dense and smoky, charred at the edges. You chew it carefully, breaking off bits to dip into the broth. Griddles, or flat stones heated in the fire, made these simple breads possible, turning grain into something portable and filling. Then there's roasting. A rabbit caught in a snare earlier is skewered on a spit, slowly turning as the fat drips into the flames. The smell fills the hut, smoky, and mouth-watering. Without fancy ovens, roasting over open fire was the go-to method for meat, whether it was rabbit for a peasant or venison for a chieftain. You can almost hear the hiss as the fat hits the embers, sending up sparks that light the shadows. Flavoring food, though, that's the tricky part. Ireland in the Middle Ages didn't have peppercorns or cinnamon lying around for peasants. Spices from faraway lands were treasures for the wealthy. Instead, ordinary folk relied on what grew nearby: onions, leeks, garlic, wild herbs like sorrel and watercress. Toss a handful into the pot, and suddenly the porridge doesn't taste quite so bland. Salt, too, was precious, mined from coastal pans or traded inland. Without it, preserving fish or meat would have been nearly impossible. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some evidence suggests that seaweed itself was used not just as food but as seasoning. Imagine tearing off a dried strip, crumbling it into the pot, and giving your stew an instant ocean kick. It might sound like a modern health food fad, but medieval Irish peasants were already onto it. You take a sip of ale, noticing again how even drink was part of the cooking process. Ale wasn't just for drinking. It sometimes flavored stews, adding richness and depth. A rabbit stewed in ale and onions suddenly tastes like something from a noble's kitchen, even if it's really just a desperate peasant's experiment. Historians still argue whether recipes like this were common or rare, but fragments of old texts hint that beer-based cooking wasn't unusual. Step outside for a moment and you'll see other setups. Larger farmsteads might build outdoor pits, digging shallow holes lined with hot stones, then wrapping meat in leaves and burying it to cook slowly. Picture an ancient slow cooker, except you're pulling venison out of the earth instead of lifting a lid. Archaeologists have uncovered these fiúlach de fire, ancient cooking sites scattered across Ireland, still blackened with centuries of fire. Some debate whether they were for brewing beer or cooking meat, but either way, they show that cooking with earth and stone was part of the Irish tradition long before the Middle Ages. Back in the smoky hut, the meal finally comes together. The bannock is pulled from the griddle, the rabbit carved from the spit, and the cauldron ladled into bowls. Everyone eats with wooden spoons hunched over, the firelight flickering across tired faces. There are no forks here. Those won't become common in Ireland for centuries. Fingers, knives, and spoons do the job just fine. It's a humble scene, but you can sense the importance. Cooking wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The hearth was the center of the home, the fire never allowed to die out completely. To let it go dark meant more than losing warmth. It meant losing the family's heart. Quirky detail to leave you with. Some families believed that tossing salt into the fire could ward off evil spirits, blending cooking with superstition. So as you finish your meal, the hiss of salt on flames is both seasoning and protection. You lean back, belly warm, smoke in your lungs, and realize that every bite here comes from fire and iron. Without them, Ireland's peasants and kings alike would go hungry. Your fingers are still greasy from tearing at rabbit meat when someone presses a fresh flatbread into your hand. It's hot, smoky from the griddle, and smells faintly sweet. Bread in medieval Ireland wasn't always the white, fluffy loaf you might picture. It was usually dense, flat, and heavy, but it was treasured all the same. Tonight, though, there's something rare clinging to its surface: honey, glistening in the firelight. Bread for the Irish peasant usually meant oatcakes or barley bannocks. These weren't baked in ovens, because peasants didn't have ovens, but on flat stones or iron griddles right over the fire. The dough was simple: oats, water, maybe a pinch of salt, sometimes mixed with a bit of sour milk to give it tang. When fresh, it was chewy and filling. When stale, it could break your teeth. You tear off a chunk, chew slowly, and swallow it down with a sip of ale. Barley bread, too, made its way into daily life, though it was heavier than wheat bread and darker in color. Wheat was the real luxury. Because the Irish climate wasn't ideal for growing wheat, most peasants rarely saw it. A soft white loaf made of wheat flour would feel almost like eating cake to you, a treat reserved for nobles and kings. Historians still argue whether wheat bread ever trickled down to commoners, or if it remained strictly for the wealthy, but either way, it became a symbol of status. Chew barley if you're poor, wheat if you're rich. And then there's honey. Sweetness was a rarity in medieval Ireland. Without sugar, which wouldn't appear in Ireland until later centuries, honey was the only real sweetener. Beekeeping was common, with hives kept in woven baskets called skeps. Peasants carefully harvested combs, risking stings for that golden prize. Honey wasn't just food, it was medicine, preservative, and even part of brewing mead, the honey wine that fueled feasts and stories. Tonight you lick your sticky fingers and think, this is worth every sting. Butter, of course, made its way onto bread too, thick and golden, melting into the warm crumb. Imagine an oatcake smeared with butter, topped with a drizzle of honey. Suddenly, your diet feels indulgent, almost royal. That combination was a medieval dessert in itself. No ovens or fancy pastries required. Curiously, some sources suggest that early Irish people also used hazelnut flour or crushed acorns in bread when grain supplies were low. The taste would have been earthy, maybe even bitter, but it kept hunger away. Quirky substitutions like this reveal just how flexible bread could be, shifting with the seasons and the harvest. There's also an odd little detail. Archaeological digs in Ireland have uncovered ancient millstones, proof that grinding grain was a household chore. Imagine standing for hours, turning heavy stones, crushing oats into flour while smoke stings your eyes and your arms ache. Bread didn't appear magically on the table. It was sweat, labor, and time ground into every bite. At the noble tables, bread became something more symbolic. Served on trenchers, thick slabs of bread that doubled as plates, it soaked up juices from roasted meats. Afterward, the trencher might be eaten, or, if the feast was especially lavish, thrown to dogs or given to the poor. Either way, bread became both utensil and food, a clever two-for-one. And honey. Nobles used it in sauces, drizzled it on roasted meats, or mixed it into mead. But peasants treasured every drop, storing combs carefully, sometimes even using honey to preserve fruit. Historians still debate how widespread honey use was among commoners, but evidence of widespread beekeeping suggests it wasn't entirely rare. Still, it remained precious, something you might taste only a few times a year. As you sit back, savoring your buttered oatcake with honey, you can't help but smile. For once, the meal feels less about survival and more about enjoyment. The sweetness lingers on your tongue, a reminder that even in a world of hardship, there were moments of pleasure. Quirky tidbit to end on. Bees themselves were so valued that under Brehon law, there were actual fines for stealing a swarm. Honey wasn't just dessert, it was wealth, law, and even a little bit of magic. So you licked the last of the honey from your hand, belly full and spirits lifted, realizing that sometimes survival tastes surprisingly sweet. Your lips are still sticky with honey when the sound of horns carries across the valley. Not feast horns this time, hunting horns. You stand from the fire and feel the tremor of hooves as a noble retinue passes by. Hounds strain at their leashes. Falcons rest hooded on gloved arms, and men on horseback grin beneath the flutter of banners. For the Irish noble, hunting was more than food. It was theater, power, and sometimes even politics. For the peasant, it was a far riskier business, one where the wrong rabbit could cost you your life. Noble hunting parties were spectacles. Deer, boar, and wild cattle roamed Ireland's forests, and to take them down was both a challenge and a show of dominance. Chieftains invited guests on hunts not just to share venison, but to demonstrate their ability to command both men and nature. Imagine the scene. Men galloping through dripping woods, spears raised, hounds baying, mud flying. The noble takes the kill, but the entire retinue basks in the triumph. A successful hunt meant roasted venison sizzling over spits that night, carved in great bloody slabs for the hall. Meanwhile, falconry became a noble art. Hawks and falcons trained to stoop on pheasants, hares, even ducks. A noble with a falcon was a noble with patience, wealth, and status, since training and maintaining these birds was no easy task. You picture a bird diving, wings folding, talons flashing as it strikes. That wasn't just hunting, it was poetry in motion, and a fine way for nobles to impress one another. But what about you, the peasant, watching from the shadows? Well, your hunting was far quieter and far more dangerous. Rabbits, hares, birds, these were your targets, caught with snares or simple bows. Why dangerous? Because under Irish law, nobles claimed hunting rights over most game animals. If a peasant was caught poaching, the punishment could be brutal, fines, loss of land, or worse. Historians still argue whether peasants routinely risked it, or if they kept to safer fare like trapping small animals and fishing. Still, survival sometimes outweighed law, and a rabbit in the pot could mean your family saw winter through. Quirky fact: hares in Irish folklore were thought to be magical. Some believed witches could transform into hares, darting across fields to spy or steal. Killing one was risky, not just legally but spiritually. Yet when hunger gnawed, even superstitions might bend. There's also the curious tale of wolf hunting. Yes, medieval Ireland had wolves, and they prowled the forests with sharp teeth and hungry eyes. Nobles sometimes organized hunts not just for sport but to protect cattle. Wolves became symbols of wildness, enemies of civilization, and later, almost completely wiped out. Imagine the tension. Your cow bleeding nervously, a distant howl drifting on the night air. Wolves hunted you as much as you hunted them. Food laws played into hunting too. The Brehon laws outlined not only who could hunt, but also how game was shared. A noble feast after a hunt was a ritualized display. Certain cuts of meat went to certain ranks, proof that even in death, the animal reinforced the social order. The chieftain received the best haunch. The bard might be gifted choice cuts to honor his song, and lower guests gnawed bones and scraps. But you, the peasant, made do. Birds caught in nets, rabbits from hidden warrens, fish poached from noble streams. These were your risks, your little acts of defiance against the order. And every now and then you succeeded, slipping home with contraband meat, roasting it quietly, praying no one noticed. Tonight, though, you watch the nobles disappear into the forest. The hound's bark fades, the falcons vanish with their masters, and you're left with silence. Somewhere nearby, your own snare might hold a rabbit. The nobles will dine on venison and pride. You'll cook yours over embers, bones cracking in the fire. 2 hunts, 2 worlds, the same hunger. And so, as the smoke curls upward, you realize, whether with horns or with snares, every belly in medieval Ireland chased meat. The difference was whether you hunted with a horse or with fear. The next morning, you wake to the sound of water rushing over stones. Ireland's landscape is stitched with rivers, lakes, and a rugged coast that seems to go on forever. If grain was the heart of survival and cattle the soul, then fish were the lifeline that threaded everything together. From the smallest stream to the great gray Atlantic, Ireland in the Middle Ages swarmed with life beneath the surface. Salmon leaping upstream, eels writhing in the mud, cod drying on wooden racks. Picture this. You walk along a riverbank, mist curling over the surface, when a silver salmon arcs out of the water in a sudden flash. For medieval Irish people, salmon wasn't just food, it was legend. The famous tale of the salmon of knowledge claimed that anyone who tasted it would gain wisdom beyond measure. Now, historians still argue whether the myth came from older Celtic traditions or from Christian allegory, but one thing's certain: salmon was prized on both table and tongue. For peasants, catching one was a rare stroke of luck. For nobles, it was a centerpiece at feasts, baked or roasted whole, its skin blistering over fire. Eels were another staple. Slippery, plentiful, and surprisingly rich, they could be caught with simple weirs or wicker traps. Imagine pulling one from the dark river at dusk, its body twisting like a rope in your hands. Unsettling, maybe, but an eel stew could warm an entire family, and dried strips of eel meat could last through winter. Some monasteries even farmed eels, building clever traps that ensured a steady supply. It wasn't glamorous food, but it was reliable, like the medieval version of canned tuna. Then there was the sea. Along the coasts, shellfish were free for the taking, mussels clinging to rocks, limpets pried off with knives, and oysters gathered by the bucket. Poor folk often ate what nobles considered lowly, sea trash foods. Funny how the tables turn. Oysters are now luxury dining, but back then they were the fast food of the shoreline. A quick fire, a cracked shell, and there you had it, a briny bite of the ocean. Fishing also connected Ireland to faraway lands. Dried cod, salted stiff as wood, made its way from the North Atlantic into markets across Europe. Even before the age of massive fleets, fish was currency. You could store it, ship it, and eat it on fasting days when meat was forbidden. Remember those endless church fasts? Fish wasn't just allowed, it was practically encouraged. A monk with a net was never hungry for long. Curious detail. Some sources describe fishermen tying cormorants or train birds to catch fish, though it's debated whether this was truly practiced in Ireland or borrowed from Eastern tailies. Historians still argue whether medieval Irish fishermen really harnessed birds like that, or if it was a fanciful traveler's yarn. Still, it sparks the image of a dark bird swooping, surfacing with a glistening trout in its beak, while you stand amazed on the bank. The noble angle, of course, was different. Fish ponds were a mark of wealth. Imagine a lord strolling past a managed pond stocked with carp or pike, knowing that dinner swam beneath the surface whenever he wished. Fresh fish on demand was as much about prestige as sustenance. At banquets, dishes of roasted salmon, spiced eels, or even exotic imports like sturgeon from afar were meant to impress. For the peasant, the shore and stream were equalizers. Nets cast into the river, wicker fish traps hidden overnight, or hands plunging into cold water to snatch wriggling eels. All these were methods of survival. The risks here weren't legal like with hunting deer, but practical. You might lose your catch to a flood, or worse, tumble into the current yourself. Still, fish kept bellies full when grain failed and cattle were scarce. Quirky tidbit. Seaweed was eaten too, especially a type called dulse, dried and chewed like a salty snack. Imagine munching on strips of red seaweed while tending sheep along the coast. It sounds odd now, but it was rich in minerals and stored well. Some Irish folks still eat it today, bridging centuries of taste. And so, as the tide rolls out, you watch villagers return with baskets heavy from the shore. Some bring shellfish, some fat salmon, others eel coiled like ropes. Smoke rises from huts as fish are strung to dry, salted, or tossed into bubbling pots. The air fills with the briny tang of the sea mixed with wood smoke. Tonight, both peasant huts and noble halls will smell of fish, though one will eat it with bare hands and the other with silver knives. From river to sea, the waters fed everyone. And as you sit with a steaming bowl of fish stew in your lap, you realize, in Ireland, hunger always looked to the water for an answer. The rain hasn't let up, but in Ireland, that's not unusual. You shuffle closer to a low fire, its warmth competing against the damp chill that sneaks through your cloak. Tonight's food isn't roasted beef or shining salmon. It's bubbling in a pot, thick and heavy, the kind of dish that clings to your ribs. Welcome to the world of stews, porridges, and broths, the everyday heartbeat of medieval Irish cooking. You peer into the cauldron and see what looks like little more than brown mush. Don't wrinkle your nose just yet, this is survival food at its finest. A porridge of oats boiled with water or milk was the staple for peasants, eaten morning and night. Sometimes thick enough to slice, sometimes runny enough to drink. If you were lucky, you might stir in a splash of buttermilk or a drizzle of honey. Bland? Maybe. Filling? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether early Irish porridge was always sweetened or often eaten plain. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Sweetness when resources allowed, plain oats when the cupboard was bare. And don't forget barley, a humble but hardworking grain that joined oats in the pot, especially when the harvest was good. Picture yourself chewing spoonfuls of this thick, earthy mash while rain lashes the thatch roof above. It's not glamorous, but it keeps you alive. When the diet demanded more hardiness, in went root vegetables, turnips, onions, leeks, sometimes wild herbs plucked from the hedgerow. Potatoes, of course, wouldn't arrive until centuries later, so don't expect mashed spuds here. Instead, think turnip stew with bits of salted pork floating like treasure. The rich would add chunks of beef, venison, or goose, but even the poor could manage a meat bone or two, boiled until every ounce of flavor surrendered into the broth. One quirky little tidbit. Archaeologists have found ancient wooden troughs believed to have been used for communal cooking. Imagine an entire village eating from one carved wooden basin, ladling out ladle after ladle of steaming oat mash. That's less fine dining and more medieval buffet, don't you think? Monasteries, too, leaned heavily on stews. With hundreds of fasting days declared by the church, monks often found ways to dress up vegetable broths or fish soups. Lent meant no meat, but creative cooks leaned on peas, beans, and lentils, foods introduced by trade and slowly gaining popularity. A monk might sip thin pea soup by candlelight while copying manuscripts, his stomach grumbling as he carefully scraped ink onto vellum. Now here, where things get interesting, nobles had a flair for turning the humble stew into a spectacle. Imagine a great hall where a pot is carried in and out comes a dish of pottage, a thick stew. But this one is flavored with imported spices, saffron if you can believe it, and garnished with fresh herbs from the Lord's garden. The contrast is almost comical. Peasants gnawing on boiled roots while nobles spoon up golden, perfumed broth under banners and candlelight. Same idea, wildly different experience. Still, in many ways, stew was the great equalizer. Everyone had a pot, everyone boiled what they could, and everyone knew that slow cooking stretched meager supplies into a meal. You could toss yesterday's stale bread in, thickening it into something hearty. You could boil down scraps that were otherwise inedible. Think of it as medieval recycling. Nothing wasted, everything eaten. You might laugh, but porridge even had a dessert version. Leftover oats could be cooled, sliced, fried, and drizzled with honey, like medieval flapjacks. Sweet treats weren't everyday fare, but when honey or berries were around, you took advantage. Speaking of berries, they often slipped into porridges, blackberries, bilberries, crabapples, giving you a tart surprise amid the beige mush. And don't forget broth itself. Sometimes thin, sometimes greasy, always comforting, it was a cure-all in medieval minds. Sick, have some broth. Tired, have some broth. Baby crying, feed it thin broth. If modern chicken soup is Jewish penicillin, then medieval Irish broth was Gaelic duct tape, fixing everything, even if only in spirit. Of course, we have to acknowledge the open scholarly debate. Was the medieval Irish pot hung directly over a hearth, or nestled in hot ashes at the edge? Some say the cauldron hung from an iron hook. Others suggest it sat low to maximize heat. Either way, the result was the same. Food slowly simmered while families huddled around, sniffing the aroma as time passed. So there you sit, spoon in hand, the firelight flickering across weary faces. You lift a ladle of thick oat porridge, steam curling upward, and taste the soft, nutty grain on your tongue. Maybe there's a sliver of pork if you're lucky. Maybe just turnip. Either way, it's filling, it's warm, and it tastes like survival. And in this damp, rain-soaked land, survival is flavor enough. The night lingers, and with it, a new scent rises, sharp, earthy, and unmistakable. You wrinkle your nose as smoke wafts from racks hung above the fire. Tonight, the lesson isn't porridge or stew. It's about how medieval Irish people made their food last in a world without refrigerators, freezers, or even airtight jars. Preservation was not a luxury. It was survival, especially through the long, wet winters when fresh food was scarce. Start with the simplest method, salting. Imagine sacks of coarse sea salt hauled inland from the coast, traded for wool or hides. Salt was precious, often worth its weight in silver, but its ability to draw out moisture from meat and fish made it indispensable. You'd rub it into cuts of beef or pork, layer it thick over eels or herring, then set them aside in wooden barrels. Days later, the meat would be stiff and briny, ready to keep for weeks, even months. Peasants rarely salted whole sides of meat. They couldn't afford that much salt. Instead, they might just preserve scraps, stretching every morsel. Then there was smoking. Here, your imagination steps into a smoky hut or the dark rafters of a cottage. Fish, particularly salmon and trout, dangled above a slow fire, absorbing the scent of oak or peat. Pork, too, was a favorite candidate for smoking. A salted and smoked side of bacon was a treasure, hung high to stay out of reach of mice. The smell must have been mouth-watering, so much so that you probably would have had to swat away curious neighbors or a sneaky child trying to snatch a piece before it was ready. Drying was another tactic, though it demanded patience. Thin strips of meat or fish laid out in the wind and sun could harden into leathery food. Imagine chewing that tough, salty jerky on a damp day while herding cattle. Not glamorous, but it filled your stomach. Herbs, too, were dried, strung up in kitchens, waiting to be tossed into stews when fresh greens weren't available. One quirky little tidbit: butter, yes, butter, was sometimes buried in bogs to preserve it. Archaeologists have literally dug up ancient bog butter, still intact after centuries, though nobody's volunteering to spread it on toast today. Why bury it? Historians still argue whether it was meant as storage, ritual offering, or simply a handy, cool, airtight fridge. Whatever the reason, it's a striking image. Lumps of golden fat tucked into the dark earth, forgotten until rediscovered. Milk itself couldn't last long, so it was churned into butter, or soured into buttermilk and curds. Cheese, though less common than in mainland Europe, was made in small rounds, something solid that could last far longer than liquid milk. Imagine traveling with a hard lump of cheese wrapped in cloth, nibbling it with oatcakes when you had nothing else. And then there's fermentation, the quiet, magical trick of turning perishables into something sturdier and often tastier. Ale and mead are obvious examples. Grains or honey transformed into drinks that didn't spoil quickly. But cabbage could be fermented into sour greens, fish pickled in brine, even milk turned into sharp, tangy drinks. Not everything tasted pleasant, but it meant the difference between hunger and fullness during lean months. We can't forget that fasting seasons made preservation doubly important. When meat was forbidden, stored fish became a staple. Salted herring and dried cod traveled across Europe, traded by the barrel load, and Ireland was no stranger to this salty commerce. A monk on the coast might be gnawing on dried fish during Lent, wishing for roasted goose but grateful he had anything at all. You glance around a medieval cottage and see evidence of these practices everywhere. Meats dangling from rafters, herbs tied in bundles near the smoke hole, barrels of brine tucked in corners, wheels of cheese stacked like treasure, butter wrapped in hide and buried just outside. Everything had to be used, stored, and saved. Waste wasn't an option. There's even a debate among scholars about whether peasants relied more heavily on smoked fish or salted pork, since regional geography played such a role. Inland folks leaned on bacon and salted beef, while coastal villages relied on drying and salting fish. Your diet could look drastically different depending on whether you lived by the sea or in the boggy interior. And remember, preserved food wasn't just about practicality. It also meant social status. If you could serve smoked salmon in midwinter, it signaled wealth. If you had butter to spare, it showed your cattle were thriving. Food preservation was as much a badge of prosperity as it was a survival trick. So picture yourself pulling a strip of chewy, salty pork from a barrel, washing it down with sour buttermilk, and then, because you deserve a little luxury, nibbling a lump of cheese saved from summer. The wind howls outside, the fire crackles, and you realize you may not be feasting like a king, but thanks to these preservation tricks, you'll make it to spring. The firelight flickers lower now, but the room around you hums with conversation and laughter, and the smell of roasted meat drifts through the smoky air. You find yourself drawn not to the hearth, but to the table, that magical place where food was more than sustenance. In medieval Ireland, eating wasn't just about filling your belly. It was about ritual, hierarchy, and community. How you sat, what you ate, and even what dish you touched first could all tell others exactly who you were. Start with the simple reality. Peasants often ate sitting on stools, benches, or even the ground, balancing wooden bowls of pottage on their laps. A communal pot was set in the center, and you dipped in with spoons carved from wood or horn. Sometimes you used your hands. Bread or oatcakes made a handy utensil. Eating with your fingers wasn't considered rude. It was expected, provided you wiped them on your tunic instead of your neighbor. Contrast this with the noble hall. Long wooden trestle tables stretched beneath high rafters, lit by smoky torches. The lord and his family sat on a raised dais at the far end, beneath painted shields or hunting trophies. Everyone else ranked below in careful order. Warriors, bards, clerics, and retainers, each knowing exactly where they belonged. You wouldn't dare sit out of place. The meal itself reinforced that hierarchy. The best cuts of meat, the richest stews, the largest drinking horns went to those at the top. By the time you reached the lower benches, you might be left with broth, bread, and bones to gnaw. One mainstream fact: the Brehon laws, Ireland's early legal codes, contained rules about hospitality. A guest was entitled to food and shelter, whether noble or peasant, but the quality of that food was expected to match the host's status. That meant you couldn't offer stale bread to a noble visitor, unless you wanted a legal complaint. Imagine a system where refusing a guest a decent meal could land you in as much trouble as stealing cattle. Now picture the sensory chaos of a noble feast. Platters of roasted pork dripping with fat were carried in. Fish gleamed with herbs and butter. Bowls of porridge sweetened with honey were ladled out. Servants moved constantly, filling cups with ale or mead. A harpist plucked away in the corner while poets recited long verses of family glories. Dogs prowled under the benches, snapping up scraps tossed down by impatient hands. The hall wasn't silent or polite. It was loud, lively, and sometimes rowdy. And yes, you probably would have had to swat away your neighbor's elbow when they reached across for more bread. But table manners did exist. Eating noisily or hoarding food was frowned upon. Passing a dish was expected, and not washing your hands before the meal was a mark of poor upbringing. Knives were common, but forks, not so much. Fingers still ruled the day. Some sources suggest that a noble might eat from a personal trencher, a slab of bread, or a wooden plate, but peasants shared bowls. Historians still argue whether trenchers were widespread in Ireland or a later import. But either way, bread often doubled as both plate and utensil. soaking up rich juices before being eaten or discarded to dogs. Now a quirky tidbit: ale wasn't always drunk from mugs. Sometimes, especially in higher circles, people used carved horns or wooden cups. But here's the kicker: there were laws about how much ale a person could be served depending on their rank. Too much mead for a lowly bard? Forget it. You had to earn your refills by social standing. So the next time you find yourself grumbling about a small pour at a bar, remember, it could be worse. Food was also tied to ritual occasions. Weddings demanded feasts that might last several days. Seasonal festivals like Samhain or Beltane featured large communal meals where everyone, rich or poor, shared in the bounty. Imagine whole oxen roasted over spits, or cauldrons so large you could practically bathe in them. These weren't just meals, they were performances, public displays of wealth, generosity, and community. And hospitality wasn't optional. Travelers expected it. If you showed up at a farmhouse hungry, you were supposed to be offered food, even if it was only oatcakes and curds. Denying a stranger a meal could curse your reputation as surely as stealing a cow. Hospitality was a kind of glue, keeping the community intact. Even within households, meals shaped relationships. Children learned to wait their turn, servants learned to watch the Lord's signals, and wives often managed the distribution of food behind the scenes. Eating wasn't only about chewing, it was about knowing your place, respecting your host, and proving your generosity. So as you sit here in the hall, ale warming your throat and the noise of laughter surrounding you, you realize this meal isn't just food, it's law, ritual, and identity. A bite of bread, a sip of ale, and suddenly you understand your own standing in the world. And maybe, just maybe, you slip the dog a scrap beneath the table because some rules were meant to be bent. Dawn creeps over the hills, painting the thatched roofs with pale gold, and with it comes a new challenge: dairy and livestock management. For medieval Irish households, animals were both a meal and a tool, and knowing how to handle them could mean the difference between feasting and famine. You trudge into the yard, boots squelching in mud, and eye the cows, goats, and chickens that define the family's survival strategy. Cows were prized for milk, which became butter, cheese, or porridge. Imagine a lowing herd in the early mist, each cow tethered or grazing in carefully managed plots. Milk had to be collected daily, often before sunrise, and handled with care. Spoiled milk could ruin days of effort. You skim off cream for butter, churn it patiently in a wooden vessel, and maybe even save some milk for a thin porridge. Every drop counts. Every failure bites hard in hunger's teeth. Goats and sheep provide more than meat. They contribute milk, wool, and hides. A few goats tethered near the hut can yield milk even in the harshest weather, and their cheese lasts longer than milk alone. Sheep, besides giving wool for clothing, can be eaten in times of need, though only carefully, since livestock is often more valuable alive than dead. Historians still debate how widespread sheep dairying really was in medieval Ireland, but archaeological evidence suggests it was common enough to support both clothing and culinary needs. Chickens cluck and peck at the yard, giving eggs and occasional meat. Eggs were versatile, boiled, baked into bread, or used to bind porridges and stews. Unlike cattle, chickens are small and easy to manage, making them a reliable food source even for poorer families. One quirky tidbit: some families believed that eggs laid on holy days or during certain festivals had magical properties, perhaps protecting the household or ensuring fertility for the coming season. Superstition blended seamlessly with practicality. Pigs, meanwhile, were the living pantry. They ate scraps, roots, and acorns, turning otherwise inedible matter into edible meat. When the time came, a pig could feed a family for weeks. But slaughtering wasn't just a casual affair. It was a ritualized, messy, and deeply communal event. Neighbors often helped, turning necessity into festivity. You can almost hear the squeals and see the rush of activity. Fire, knives, smoke, and teamwork all merging into one chaotic day. Milk preservation was another challenge. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so it was often turned into curds and whey. Curds could be eaten immediately or pressed into cheese for storage, while whey was sometimes given to pigs or used in porridge. Butter, as you already know, could be salted or buried in bogs for long-term storage. These methods show just how creative people were with every animal product. Then there's the issue of feed. Cattle ate hay and oats, sheep nibbled grass, and pigs foraged for roots and acorns. A bad harvest meant not only less human food but also starving livestock. Families had to plan months ahead, storing fodder and rationing carefully. Survival wasn't just a matter of eating. It was a matter of logistics, strategy, and sometimes sheer luck. Quirky historical tidbit. In some Irish regions, cows were even considered currency. A single animal could pay fines, secure marriages, or serve as dowry. The line between wealth and food was thin. Your cow could nourish you or elevate your status, depending on timing and circumstance. Monastic communities took animal care seriously too. Monks raised cattle, goats, and chickens to feed themselves and pilgrims. They perfected techniques for butter, cheese, and milk storage, often blending practical skills with religious discipline. Some even kept fish ponds on monastery grounds, ensuring protein without breaking fast rules. By mid-morning, the yard is alive with activity. Milk is churned, chickens are rounded up, pigs root in the mud, and sheep bleat from nearby pastures. You scoop fresh milk into a pot, minding every drop. It will become porridge, curds, butter, or cheese. Every animal, every drop, every egg has its role in keeping the household fed. And as you step back, feeling the weight of responsibility and relief, you realize, in medieval Ireland, survival is a conversation with the land, the animals, and the seasons. You don't just eat, you manage, plan, and negotiate life itself. By now you've tended animals, churned butter, gathered herbs, and maybe even roasted a fat salmon by a smoky hearth. But step back for a moment. Meals are not only fuel, they're also culture, ritual, and meaning. In medieval Ireland, food wasn't just about survival. It was about status, spirituality, and story. Tonight, as the candles burn low and you feel that soft hum of sleep at your edges, let's wander deeper into how meals shaped identity, faith, and community. Picture yourself at a long wooden table. On one end, a chieftain slices roast venison with a bronze-handled knife, the juices spilling into carved grooves of a trencher. On the other, monks spoon barley stew into wooden bowls, their heads bowed in silent prayer. At both extremes, peasant and noble, the act of eating becomes performance. Who eats first? Who serves? What gets shared and what gets hoarded? These are questions that determined where you stood in the grand ladder of medieval Irish life. Take bread, for example. You've gnawed oatcakes with peasants by the fire, dry and crumbly, barely softened with butter. But nobles feasted on wheaten loaves, sometimes spiced or honeyed. Eating wheat was a luxury in Ireland, since oats thrived better in the damp soil. Bread was a marker. Rough oats meant survival, soft wheat meant privilege. Historians still argue whether imported wheat was widespread in rural Ireland or reserved mainly for ecclesiastical feasts, but the symbolism was clear. A loaf wasn't just a loaf, it was a statement. Now imagine the rituals around fasting. The medieval church dictated strict fast days when meat and animal products were forbidden. You might have to switch to fish, eggs, vegetables, or plain gruel. Monks took these rules even further, sometimes living almost entirely on bread, water, and beer during Lenten stretches. And here's a quirky tidbit. Irish annals record monks deliberately eating wild herbs with bitter sap, almost like a dare to see who could out-humble the other. Forget spicy wings challenges. Try gnawing raw sorrel leaves in a damp stone cell. Food also tied tightly to law and rank. Ancient Irish law tracts like the Brehon laws spelled out who could eat what at banquets. A noble was entitled to choice cuts of meat, while a lower-ranked guest might only receive broth. These weren't casual preferences. They were codified rules, ensuring that food reinforced hierarchy. Imagine the awkward silence if someone reached for the wrong portion, a potential scandal in stew form. Festivals made meals explode into color. At Beltane or Samhain, households slaughtered animals, roasted meats, baked cakes, and brewed ale in great vats. Flames leapt, drums pounded, and people ate until bellies were round. Meals during festivals carried both pagan echoes and Christian blessings, layered into one seamless ritual. You can picture a platter of pork carried to the fire, blessed by both druidic whispers and priestly prayers, as villagers clapped and laughed under the stars. And then there were taboos and superstitions. Some foods were avoided on certain days, eggs might be skipped, or fish deemed unlucky if caught during storms. One story claims warriors refused eel because its slippery form was considered cowardly. Another quirky note: butter, so essential, was sometimes used in blessings, even rubbed on infants' foreheads as protection. You churn it by hand, and suddenly it's both sandwich spread and sacred shield. Meals could also be political theater. When chieftains invited neighboring lords, the feast wasn't only about generosity, it was about dominance. The quantity of meat, the quality of ale, the endless refills of trencher bread all sent a message. I can feed armies. I am strong. Follow me. Refusing to attend, or worse, walking out hungry, was more than rude. It was rebellion. And let's not forget storytelling. Bards and poets were often present at feasts, trading songs for meals. A generous host might reward them with the best cuts. A stingy one risked satire sung across the countryside. Imagine tucking into roasted goose while a bard strums beside you, half praising, half mocking the very way you chew. In medieval Ireland, your reputation could rise or fall on the flavor of your broth. By now you see, food wasn't just a necessity, it was woven into law, faith, and pride. It told people who they were, where they stood, and even how close they were to God. Every oatcake, every feast, every shared pot of broth became part of Ireland's living script. And as you sit at that long table, whether peasant or king, you're not just filling your belly, you're tasting an entire worldview, bite by bite. The afternoon sun filters weakly through the thatch as you move from the hearth to the pantry, the day's chores giving way to contemplation. You've seen smoke-filled huts, noble halls, rivers teeming with fish, and herds grazing in misty fields. You've tasted porridge, bannocks, salted fish, roasted meat, and honeyed treats. And now, as the day wanes, it's time to consider the legacy of medieval Irish food, how those humble practices and rich feasts shaped lives, survival, and culture. Start with the reality: food was survival. The peasants relied on oats, barley, and root vegetables. Every meal was calculated, every morsel conserved. Losing a cow, a basket of grain, or a handful of salted fish could spell weeks of hunger. You trudge to the well, fill a bucket, and realize just how intertwined sustenance was with labor. Gathering, milking, chopping, tending livestock. It was a constant cycle. But survival alone doesn't tell the full story. Food also carried identity and pride. Butter churned with care, a well-roasted pig, a perfectly smoked side of salmon. These weren't just calories, they were statements. Peasants learned resourcefulness, mixing foraged herbs into bland porridge, drying seaweed for flavor, improvising substitutes when wheat was rare. Every small success in the kitchen reinforced autonomy, pride, and resilience. Nobles, on the other hand, showcased power and sophistication through food. Feasts were political theater. Large halls filled with smoke, music, and conversation, every dish meticulously prepared, and every cut of meat assigned by rank. Imported spices, rare wines, and golden loaves signaled not only wealth but influence. Eating at a noble table wasn't just about pleasure. It was about demonstrating control over both the natural and social order. Quirky tidbit. Some historians suggest that certain monasteries preserved culinary knowledge, blending spiritual discipline with practical innovation. Monks experimented with fermentation, cheese making, and even early brewing techniques. They may have been Ireland's first food scientists, though with vows of silence and lots of prayer. You wander to the riverbank, watching a flash of salmon leap. Fish, like meat and grain, wasn't just eaten. It was part of ritual, law, and seasonality. Preservation techniques, salting, smoking, drying, ensured that communities could survive harsh winters and fasting periods. Even superstitions influenced food. Eggs, butter, or certain herbs were believed to ward off misfortune or grant blessings. Survival, magic, and belief mingled in ways that shaped daily life. By the evening, the smoke curls lazily from huts and chimneys, mingling with the scent of wood, herbs, and roasting meat. Families gather, some around a fire, some in noble halls, each eating in their own way yet bound by a shared Irish tradition. Bread soaked with broth, honey dripping from a spoon, ale warming hands, salted fish steaming over coals. It's a symphony of survival, ingenuity, and joy. And perhaps the greatest lesson: food connects generations. Recipes passed down, methods preserved, rituals observed. These small acts of sustenance became culture itself. From peasant porridge to kingly banquets, every meal is a story, every flavor a chapter in Ireland's living history. You realize that understanding medieval Irish food isn't just about ingredients. It's about understanding a people, their land, their beliefs, and their resilience. So you lean back, let the last embers glow, and remember that every bite tells a story of work, community, and life itself. The seasons will turn, the rivers will run, the herds will graze, and through it all, the people will eat, survive, and celebrate the enduring gift of food. Now dim the lights and imagine the hush of an Irish evening settling over the land. You can hear the distant rush of a river, the soft bleating of sheep in the mist, and the crackle of the fire as it slowly dies down. The smells of the day linger, smoky meats, sweet honey, fresh herbs, and with them comes a sense of quiet satisfaction. You realize that life, no matter how hard, carries small comforts: a warm meal, the laughter of family, the safety of a roof overhead. Let your thoughts drift to the simple pleasures you've glimpsed tonight: breaking bread with those who work the land, sipping ale by the fire, watching salmon leap in the morning light. Even the smallest morsels, eaten with care and gratitude, become stories in themselves. There's a gentle rhythm in the old ways, a pattern of survival and celebration woven into every season, every harvest, every feast. Imagine the last of the smoke curling into the sky as the village quiets, the noble hall emptying after a banquet, the field stretching silent under twilight. Even the tiniest, most humble kitchen holds a kind of magic: the heat of the hearth, the aroma of food, and the comfort of community. You feel the lingering warmth in your belly, in your heart, and in your mind. And as your eyelids grow heavy, take one last breath of the world you've explored tonight: earthy, smoky, sweet, and alive. Feel the rhythm of medieval Ireland pulse gently beneath your thoughts. Soon, you will drift into dreams, carrying the taste, smell, and texture of this journey with you. Rest easy, knowing that the people you've met, the meals you've imagined, and the stories you've touched will settle softly in your memory. Sweet dreams.